Hey guys, AllyZieMage here, and welcome to my Thanksgiving dinner video. This is my first year cooking Thanksgiving dinner, especially all on my own. I don't think I've cooked any of these dishes solely by myself before. It's always been with my mom. But because of the pandemic, that's not happening this year, or that didn't happen this year because it's technically past tense now. So what I did is record myself making all of the different dishes that my family typically has during Thanksgiving, despite the fact that I was feeding very few people, and I accidentally got a 20-pound turkey because that's all that was left in the store by the time I got there. There's going to be a voiceover of how I made all the things, and maybe some just detailed description about why my family makes them, if I know why. Most of this I don't know why. But yeah, let's get into it. Alright, so first we're looking at the stuff that I did the day before for preparation. What I started on was the pumpkin bread, mostly because I need to let butter soften to room temperature for the most part for everything else. But in this recipe I was just melting down the butter. I unfortunately did not record putting all the dry ingredients into the bowl, but it's just like pumpkin spice mix with some bread flour and some freshly grated ginger. Then I stirred that all up so that it was well combined. I think there's also salt, baking powder, and baking soda in this. So there's the melted butter, and then I'm using Libby's pureed pumpkin because that's just what my family's always used. So you just scrape out the pumpkin. I usually use a rubber spatula, but I don't really have any of my own. So I ended up just using a knife. It worked pretty well. I mean, it was a little bit more difficult. The puree stuck to the knife a bit more, but honestly, it works. If you don't really want to make the investment into kitchen gadgets and tools that you won't use super frequently, because I honestly almost never use a rubber spatula now, and I used to use it all the time as a kid just because they were there. This method works just perfectly fine. Then after getting the puree into the butter, you mix it all together so then it forms into kind of like a smooth paste is probably the best description of the consistency that it'll end up in. It just takes a lot of gentle, vigorous whisking. Yes, those are contradictory. You have to start out gentle and then get pretty rough with it. Should end up looking like that, and then you put in the obscene amount of sugar. We're putting in both brown and white sugar into this, so just regular granulated sugar and then brown sugar. If you don't have brown sugar, you can just put in the same amount of granulated sugar as it's calling for brown sugar and then add in some molasses. You'd have to look up the ratio of how much molasses to sugar is in light brown sugar or dark brown sugar, depending on what the recipe calls for. Then I also ran out of sugar in my original bag, so here is me trying to estimate the amount that I missed originally, along with putting in some more. The bread came out perfectly fine, so I think it worked out. There's no problem there. Mix that all into the puree mix that we had done earlier. This is not really that difficult or like muscle intensive. I think pumpkin bread's one of the easiest things to make. I'd put it on the same level as like brownies. That honestly is just like a little bit of whisk work and you're good. Then we crack in our 3 eggs. This recipe called for a lot of eggs, more than I was expecting, and this kind of ruined a bit of my plans for deviled eggs later on in the video. Then you can't really see the bottle, but I added in some pure vanilla extract. You can always use imitation vanilla. It has a bit of a different flavor, but it works in a pinch, and if you don't have the budget for like actual vanilla extract, that stuff is insanely expensive. And then yeah, just whisk it all together once more. Make a nice, smooth, kind of like creamy consistency at this point. It's going to be very like light, very liquidy, and not much of a batter quite yet, because of course there's no dry ingredients, which brings us to this part. I put in about a third of my dry ingredients at a time, and then whisk it together. It did become a bit tough towards the end. I also suggest trying to wet your dry ingredients before whisking vigorously or whisking hard. So that's kind of what I'm doing right here, is I'm just trying to like turn the flour over into the mixture before actually getting into the whisking. Yeah, it works out pretty well for me, especially if you're using an electric beater and you don't have much control of how fast it goes, because the lowest setting is still kind of fast. I suggest kind of using the beaters to mix around your flour into your batter. Here we are on the last third of the flour mixture added into the pumpkin puree mixture. So that's why it's pretty thick, and then we get this beautiful, almost like peanut butter consistency and color as well. No, we are not making peanut butter today. So you want to oil down a pan, a loaf pan. This will keep the bread from sticking to it and come out a lot easier when it's done from the oven. Really suggest taking your time and making sure that's well greased before pouring in your lovely batter. This was a glass bowl with no friction, and I was wearing a very soft sweatshirt, so the bowl kept slipping as I was trying to pour it in. That was a fun time. Then I am a genius and forgot to put in the craisins for my cranberry pumpkin bread when the mixture was in the bowl, so I had to try and put them in on top like this, and then just kind of mush them down into the batter, which isn't really a great idea because it really gets stuck into the whisk a lot. And honestly, I would usually use a wooden spoon to just fold them into the batter, and then I just kind of patted it out and shook it around to try and get the loaf as flat as possible. Alright, next we're starting with the dinner roll, so you just need to get your yeast mixture running first, which is usually just putting some active dry yeast with sugar and some form of liquid into a bowl and let it set for, this recipe called for 5 minutes. There's no like guaranteed time, and this recipe also used warm milk. Don't use cold stuff because yeast is a living organism and thrives better in warm environments. So you just mix that all together very gently and then leave it in the bowl for about 5 minutes as this recipe called for before adding in some more sugar. Sugar is what feeds yeast, and it'll also sweeten your dinner rolls a tad bit. This recipe only called for 1 egg, so we very precariously put that into the bowl. I was having a problem cracking that one from what I remember. And then add in some butter. This technically was supposed to have already been cubed up into smaller pieces before I'd put it in, but I just softened it and that was it. So I kind of cut it up with a spoon to pretty much put into that same consistency that the recipe was calling for. Most of the reason why it probably calls for it that way instead of breaking it up like this is because it expected you to use like a food processor or some real way of making bread instead of this very butchered way, which did not come out with the best bread. Bread is really hard to make if you don't have fancy tools. These were still edible, they weren't bricks, but it absolutely could have been better. So I just start adding the bread flour gradually along with some salt and I think baking soda earlier. I'm not entirely certain. And then we're just going to mix that up until it starts forming a dough and gradually adding in more flour as needed. There is a finite amount of flour to add in, so I'm just kind of building up to that amount of flour as I just continuously mix it in. Eventually you should end up with a shaggy mass of dough that starts looking somewhat like this, and then off camera I ended up finishing this off with my hands to just try and get it into the most cohesive singular unit as possible before putting it out into a bowl to let rise. It was a grease bowl covered in saran wrap that I left near my oven so that I was still in a warm environment. This is what they looked like before going into the oven after their second rise, and this is how they came out. They didn't really poof up, but that was fine. They were still edible and good. It's bread. Next, we're going to work on the sugar cookies. I actually made this dough on Tuesday, so the day before filming this, because it should chill for 4 to 6 hours, preferably overnight. Pretty much whenever you want firm, stable cookies, it's usually best to chill it overnight. It keeps it from expanding too much in the oven. Sugar cookies are cutout cookies, so you don't want them to expand too much. So I rolled out the dough using a marble rolling pin. I suggest this because it is heavy and the weight will really help you with firm doughs that have been chilled overnight because they are a bitch to roll out. I don't really have Thanksgiving or fall themed cookie cutters, so we have dinosaurs in miscellaneous shapes. So yeah, my boyfriend and I enjoyed some Bronchiosauruses, some pterodactyls, some Triceratops, and some T-Rexes for our Thanksgiving treats, along with like moons and diamonds and clovers and teddy bears. This is how they turned out in the end, and yeah, I think they were pretty enjoyable. Next is the beast of the dinner, which is the turkey. At this point, I just pulled out a chunk of ice from the pan. Fun fact. This turkey was still definitely frozen by the time I was trying to work on it because I bought it way too late, and I bought one that was much bigger than I was expecting. So I tried to do a dry brine overnight, hoping for the best, by putting salt and pepper all over the carcass. And I had to leave the turkey neck in, and I couldn't find the bag of giblets until I took it out of the oven the next day, because I always expected them to be in the cavity, and they ended up being at the head, and it was really weird. I also hoped that the salt would thaw out the turkey a bit more, because salt does help things melt a little bit faster. Yeah, I just rubbed all that in, and then we come to Thursday, the day of Thanksgiving. So I made a vegetable medley to just put under the turkey, and then also worked on my deviled eggs. I made most of this off camera. It's just the egg yolk, salt, pepper, mustard, and mayo smushed together. I have no ratios for that because I just always eyeball and just taste for flavor. Then you top it with paprika. I had considered topping some with cayenne and some with paprika, so then some of them turned into actual deviled eggs and were hot, but didn't end up doing that. And then I did the fun part of mutilating and manhandling my turkey. We did get it thawed overnight and through some heavy maneuvering and science in the morning. But yeah, so at this point, I'm slicing open the skin near the thigh and the breast to be able to get my fingers underneath it to pull the skin off of the actual meat of the bird, because this will give you a really crispy skin, and no one wants soggy skin. That's just kind of gross. But it is a very gross process to watch, and I have a lot of it in here. But your goal is to try and get as much skin off of the meat as possible to really open that up and air it out. And then this also gives you a perfect opportunity to smush a ton of compound butter into the cavity between the skin and the meat itself. This will flavor the actual meat, because if you just put all of your seasonings on the skin itself, that won't flavor anything underneath. It'll just flavor the skin. So this is a good way to do that. It also puts a wonderful color onto your meat itself since you have all this butter sizzling onto it. My compound butter is just butter, salt, no pepper, sage, thyme, garlic and onion powder as well. And I just used some softened room temperature butter, put all the spices into it, and then mushed it together with my hands, and then patted it down into the bird. It turned out pretty well. I also used toothpicks to pretty much suture the skin shut, so then we don't have any like large gaping holes, because that would lead to the meat itself drying out underneath. Top it off with some salt and pepper, once again, because a lot of it came off in my process of trying to fix this frozen mess. And then yeah, stick it in the oven. Next we have our candied yams. It's just some candied yams in a can thrown into a pan. How many of these can I make rhyme? And then topped off with cold butter. I don't think you need to use cold butter. It's just easier to slice to get like firm, even pieces mixed out throughout the entire pan of candied yams from a can. Put a good, generous handful of brown sugar coating the entire thing. It's candied yams. There's sugar, butter, sugar, some carbs, more sugar, and butter. Because we top it off with marshmallows. And those will get a nice golden, crispy brown texture on it and just be really, really yummy to bite into. And then onto the final dish of the night, which is green bean casserole. I put cream of mushroom soup and milk into a pan already, then throw in some pepper. You really don't need a bowl to prepare either of these last two. They can both just be prepared in the pan, which is fantastic. And then I kind of loosely, roughly mix that together for a bit so that it starts separating out the cream of mushroom soup into the milk mixture a bit more. Then we need to chop up our lovely little green beans. I used fresh green beans that haven't been cooked at all because I like a more firm and crisp green bean casserole. If you want something a little softer, then use pre-cooked green beans or green beans from a can. Work really well. And then yeah, you just kind of mixed it back into the soup and milk concoction. This part is a little difficult of just not having a bowl to do it, but it's perfectly reasonable and doable. Like there's no reason for a bowl. And then mix in some crunchy fried onions. This recipe can be found on the back of the French's fried onions container. That's pretty much just what my family always uses. And then this is what the entire dinner ended up looking like. That turkey turned into an excellent color. I think a lot of that's because of the compound butter. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed watching this video about what my family usually makes for Thanksgiving that I attempted to replicate, and I think I did a pretty good job. My boyfriend has had Thanksgiving at my family's place last year, and he said that this year's dinner was perfectly comparable to that, and maybe a little bit better. Don't tell my mom. Let me know if any of these dishes look similar to what you eat at Thanksgiving if you do celebrate Thanksgiving, and if you don't, let me know what of these looked interesting that you haven't tried before, and like what you learned from this of what weird Americans eat for Thanksgiving. It's a lot of fall, just like really, really unhealthy dishes is what I came to the realization of when making all this. Like the obscene amount of butter is just everywhere. But yeah, I hope you guys have yourself a magical day, and I shall see you next time.